A forgotten art determined the fate of civilizations. Long before modern luggage, explorers faced a monumental puzzle: how to pack for years into the dark unknown. This is the hidden history of expedition logistics, the precise science of stuffing a wooden ship with everything needed to survive monsters, mutiny, and madness. By the end, you will understand the brilliant and sometimes brutal calculations that made the age of discovery possible. We will uncover why a single rotten lemon could be more valuable than gold, and how a chest of glass beads could purchase an empire. When you picture an explorer's greatest weapon, what do you truly see? So what made the final cut for a journey into the void? Every expedition began not with packing, but with a brutal process of elimination. Space was the ultimate currency, measured in cubic feet aboard a creaking wooden world. The master list was a document of survival, a stark hierarchy of necessity where sentiment had no place. At the very top sat the tools of navigation, the instruments that would guide them across trackless oceans. An astrolabe or its successor, the cross staff, allowed a navigator to measure the sun's angle and estimate their latitude, their position north or south. The magnetic compass was their unwavering guide, a simple needle pointing the way when the stars were hidden. And then there was the log, a rope with knots, thrown overboard to measure the ship's speed. These were not just tools, they were the very eyes of the ship. Timekeeping was another critical puzzle. How did they know what day it was after weeks at sea? They relied on the Sandglass, a simple timer that had to be religiously turned every half hour. This constant, monotonous ritual was the heartbeat of the ship, marking the watches and helping to estimate longitude on long east-west voyages. Alongside these instruments, the written word was vital. Ink, quills, and heavy paper were packed away for the captain's log. Every sighting, every storm, every strange bird had to be recorded. This log was more than a diary. It was legal proof of discovery, a record for future voyages, and sometimes the only legacy of a crew that never returned. Then there was the captain's personal chest, a locked box that held the soul of the mission. Inside lay the precious sea charts, often hand-drawn and wildly inaccurate by our standards, but representing the total knowledge of the world. There were the sealed orders from the Crown or the trading company, instructions not to be opened until a specific latitude was reached, dictating the true, secret purpose of the voyage. And often, tucked beside these documents, were the seeds of empire's small, valuable trade goods. Glass beads, bolts of colorful cloth, and bits of metal were not personal souvenirs. They were strategic currency, intended to open dialogues and secure alliances in unknown lands. This single chest held the map, the mission, and the means to pay for it all. But these master lists only accounted for the tools of command. What about the fuel for the men who wielded them? But the most critical cargo of all was the one that fed the men. Every voyage was a race against starvation, and the ship's hold was transformed into a floating pantry designed to last for years. The core of this diet was hardtack, a simple biscuit made from flour and water, baked rock hard to survive moisture and pests. These biscuits were so durable they could last for decades, though they often became home to weevils, requiring sailors to tap them sharply on the table to dislodge the insects before eating. Alongside the hardtack came vast quantities of salted meat, packed tightly in barrels. Salt pork and salt beef were preserved in brine, creating a nearly indestructible, though incredibly salty, source of protein. To balance this, barrels of dried peas and beans provided essential, if monotonous, nutrition. Imagine the sheer volume, thousands of biscuits and hundreds of barrels, each one a tiny life raft of calories. The ship's cook was a central, if unsung, figure in this delicate ecosystem. His galley was a small, dangerously fire-prone kitchen, often just a brick hearth built on a bed of sand. His main tool was the ship's copper cauldron, in which he would create a single daily meal for the entire crew, typically a stew called lobscouse. This dish was a practical marvel, a way to soften the hardtack and make the tough, salted meat palatable by boiling it all together with any available peas or beans. The cook held immense power over morale. A bad cook could turn an already difficult journey into a torment. How did they manage this precious supply to avoid complete disaster? Rationing was a strict mathematical science. Each man received a carefully measured daily allowance, his pound of hardtack and portion of salted meat. The ship's purser was responsible for doling out these rations, often under the watchful eye of the captain to prevent theft or corruption. But the greatest threat was not just starvation, it was scurvy. This mysterious illness, which caused gums to bleed and old wounds to reopen, was the ghost that haunted every long voyage. They did not yet understand it was a lack of vitamin C, but through grim experience, they learned that certain foods could ward it off. Some captains carried crates of lemons or limes, a precious anti-scorbutic that was worth its weight in gold. Others relied on sauerkraut or a vial-together malt brew called spruce beer. The choice of which preventative to pack, or whether to pack it at all, was a gamble that would determine how many men would be left to sail the ship home. Yet water itself was the most fragile link in this chain of survival. A wooden ship, surrounded by an endless expanse of ocean, was perpetually thirsty. Storing fresh water for months, even years, was a logistical nightmare. The solution was the humble cask, thousands of them, lined up in the dark, damp hold. These barrels were not just containers, they were complex ecosystems. Water, drawn from rivers and springs believed to be pure, would slowly turn foul. Algae would bloom in the stagnant darkness, turning the life-giving liquid green and slimy. Weevils and other contaminants would find their way in, and the wood of the casks itself could taint the flavor. A sailor never knew if his daily ration would be crisp and clean or a putrid sip he had to hold his nose to drink. This was why alcohol became the true liquid gold of the high seas. Beer was a staple, brewed to be consumed relatively quickly before it soured. It provided calories and a small psychological comfort. Wine, especially fortified wines like port or sack, lasted far longer in the cask. But the ultimate seafaring drink was spirits, particularly rum and brandy. These potent liquids did not spoil. They could be stored almost indefinitely, and they became the backbone of naval life. Every sailor received a daily ration of rum, a ritual that was as much about morale as it was about hydration. That daily tot was a tiny moment of warmth and numbness, a brief escape from the cold, wet, and terrifying reality of life at sea. It was a tool for social control, a reward for hard work, and even a form of currency, traded among the crew for favors or extra food. But this reliance on alcohol created its own set of dangers. A drunken crew in the middle of a storm was a captain's worst nightmare. The ship's supply of spirits was kept under heavy lock and key, a treasure as closely guarded as the navigational instruments themselves. The careful management of water and alcohol was a constant, delicate dance between survival and disaster. Beyond the ship's official rations and the captain's locked chest lay a more intimate form of preparation, the explorer's personal kit. Unlike the standardized supplies, this was a collection of items chosen for individual survival and comfort, a tiny fortress of self against the overwhelming unknown. Their clothing was their first and most constant layer of protection. Forget fancy silks or delicate linens. Every thread was a practical decision. Wool was the fabric of choice, a durable, dense material that provided warmth even when soaking wet, a vital quality in the constant spray and damp of the ocean. For heavy labor on deck, they wore tough canvas or coarse linen trousers and shirts, clothes that could withstand salt, sun, and the rough friction of ropes. Footwear was a matter of life and death on a slippery, heaving deck. An explorer would pack multiple pairs of boots, each serving a distinct purpose. There were sturdy leather boots for everyday work, designed with grip to cling to wet wood. For landing parties, they might have taller, sturdier boots to navigate sharp coral, muddy riverbanks, or unfamiliar terrain. The care and maintenance of this footwear was a daily ritual, as a split sole or rotten leather could lead to a crippling injury far from any help. For the relentless rain and towering waves, an oilskin coat was a prized possession. This was a long coat made of canvas or heavy linen, treated with linseed oil to make it waterproof. It was stiff, it had a distinct smell, but it was the closest thing to a portable shelter a sailor had, a crucial barrier against the chilling wet that could lead to sickness and despair. Yet, nestled alongside these hard-wearing garments was often a single, surprising item, a set of fine clothes. This could be a velvet doublet, a clean silk shirt, or a pair of polished leather shoes. This was not for personal vanity. It was a tool of diplomacy. When stepping ashore to meet a potential ally or a powerful local leader, appearance was a form of communication. A well-dressed captain projected authority, wealth, and seriousness of purpose. That one fine outfit, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was as strategic as any map or trade good, a key meant to unlock doors in civilizations they could not yet imagine. But this entire world of wood and cloth was constantly under attack. The ship was not just a vessel. It was a living, breathing entity that needed constant care, and its survival depended on a floating workshop packed into the deepest hold. A master carpenter and his team were as vital as any navigator, armed with a staggering array of tools. There were adzes and axes for rough shaping of timber, saws of various sizes for precise cuts, and heavy mallets and chisels for intricate joinery. Every tool had a purpose, from drilling holes with a brace and bit to driving home iron nails with a hammer. These were not just for building, they were for battlefield medicine on a ship wounded by storms. Alongside the tools came the raw materials for repair. Spare lumber, often different types of wood for different purposes, was carefully stowed. Planks for decking, heavier beams for structural members, and even pre-shaped pieces like replacement rudder paddles were all part of this mobile forest. The most critical repair, however, was making the ship watertight. This required a strange and sticky arsenal. There was tar, a thick black substance derived from pine trees, used for coating ropes, and wood to repel water. Pitch, a thicker, more viscous cousin of tar, was heated in great kettles and poured into seams. And then there was oakum, a humble but essential material made from old, picked-apart ropes that had been tarred. The caulker would take this fibrous oakum and, using a mallet and a caulking iron, forcefully hammer it into the gaps between the ship's planks. This created a flexible, water-resistant seal that could flex with the ship's movement. Above the waterline, the sails were the ship's lungs, and their repair was a constant, frantic task. Huge bolts of heavy canvas sailcloth were stored in the driest part of the hold the crew could manage. When a sail ripped in a gale, the sailmaker and his apprentices would spread the damaged canvas on deck, often in howling wind and stinging spray. With large, curved needles and thick thread, they would stitch a patch strong enough to withstand the immense pressure of the wind. This was not delicate sewing, it was a brutal act of reinforcement, each stitch a pledge against the storm. Every nail, every barrel of tar, every bolt of cloth was a direct investment in returning home. The ship was their only life support system, and its failure meant a swift and certain end. Yet beneath the carpenter's tools and the sailmaker's canvas lay a different kind of inventory, one designed for a more brutal form of repair. The ship was a floating fortress, and its arsenal was a carefully calculated balance of defense, deterrence, and the grim potential for violence. For every man aboard, a personal sidearm was as essential as his daily ration of rum. The cutlass was the sailor's constant companion, a short, heavy sword with a curved blade perfect for the chaotic, close-quarter fighting on a crowded deck. Its design was brutally practical, allowing for powerful, slashing strokes in tight spaces where longer swords were useless. Alongside it, many men carried a flintlock pistol, a single-shot weapon that was devastating at close range but slow to reload. These were not weapons of conquest in the grand sense. They were tools for last-ditch survival, for repelling boarders in the dead of night, or during a surprise attack from a rival ship. But the ship's defensive capabilities extended far beyond hand-to-hand combat. For landing parties and for reinforcing the ship's own defenses, there were muskets and pikes. The musket was the era's standard infantry weapon, a long, heavy gun that required a complex sequence of steps to load and fire. A well-drilled landing party, armed with muskets, could project power onto a foreign shore, whether for hunting large game to supplement their dwindling rations or for establishing a perimeter in unknown territory. The pike, a long wooden shaft topped with a steel point, was a simpler but equally vital weapon. It created a defensive wall of sharpened steel, effective against both mounted warriors and hostile crowds, a way to keep an unknown threat at a distance. Perhaps the most telling piece of equipment, however, was the small cannon, often called a swivel gun, mounted on the ship's boats. These were not the massive guns that line the main deck for naval battles. These were lighter, more mobile cannons that could be loaded with grapeshot, essentially a bag of metal scraps that turned the weapon into a giant shotgun. From a landing boat approaching a beach, a single blast from a swivel gun could clear a stretch of sand, a devastating display of force intended to shock and awe any potential opposition. This is the tragic duality of these supplies. The same musket that could bring down a deer to feed a hungry crew could also be turned against people. The very tools that ensured the explorers' survival often spelled destruction for the indigenous peoples they encountered. This arsenal was not packed for a specific enemy, it was packed for the unknown itself, a heavy metallic insurance policy against a world of unimaginable risks. But the most brilliant calculations were often reserved for the smallest items. Beneath the cannons and behind the barrels of salt pork, explorers packed a different kind of currency, a treasury of trinkets designed to purchase an entire world. This was the pocket money of empire, a collection of seemingly ordinary objects whose value was transformed the moment they crossed a foreign beach. A string of glass beads, a small mirror, a handful of brass bells, these were not mere souvenirs. They were the keys to survival and the instruments of first contact. The primary goal was practical and immediate, to acquire fresh food and clean water. After months at sea, a basket of tropical fruit or a freshly caught fish was worth more than a chest of silver. A friendly exchange with a local village could replenish a ship's water casks with sweet, fresh water, saving the crew from the green, slimy dregs in the hold. But these goods purchased something even more vital than provisions. They bought knowledge. A few iron nails could secure a local guide for a day. A bright piece of cloth might be exchanged for information about safe anchorages, dangerous currents, or the location of other resources. The trade goods were a bridge, a way to translate the unknown into a language of mutual, if temporary, benefit. The selection of these items was a study in anthropology conducted from thousands of miles away. Explorers and their backers had to guess what would be considered rare and beautiful in a culture they had never seen. Glass beads were a perennial favorite because the technology to create them was unknown in many parts of the world. Their shimmer and perfect, round shapes were objects of wonder. Small mirrors held a similar, almost magical appeal, offering many people their first ever clear view of their own reflection. The sound of a brass bell was another powerful tool, its clear, bright chime cutting across languid barriers. But the most transformative items were those made of metal, particularly iron. An iron axe head or a simple knife was not just a trinket. It was a technological revolution in the palm of your hand. For a society using stone tools, the strength and sharpness of forged iron was a miracle. It could fell trees faster, carve wood more precisely, and process food more efficiently. A single iron tool could dramatically change a family's quality of life, making it an object of immense, undeniable value. This is the profound irony of these carefully packed chests. The cheapest, most mass-produced goods from Europe became the most powerful currency in the New World, a currency that could buy loyalty, secure alliances, and ultimately pave the way for everything that would follow. These navigational marvels demanded protection as meticulous as their use. While the ship itself was built to endure violent storms and crashing waves, the instruments that charted its course were fragile assemblies of wood, brass, and finely engraved scales. A single knock against a ship's timber could bend a siding pin, rendering a reading useless. A splash of salt spray could fog a mirror or corrode delicate markings, turning a precision tool into a worthless piece of scrap metal. To safeguard these priceless eyes of the ship, craftsmen constructed specialized protective cases, often lined with soft velvet or felt. The astrolabe, a heavy brass disc engraved with a map of the heavens, would be nestled securely in its own custom-fitted wooden box. The quadrant, a quarter circle of wood with a weighted plumb line, required a case that protected its straight edges while keeping the line itself from tangling. The cross staff, a simple but effective tool that required the navigator to stare directly at the sun, was often stored disassembled, its various components each having their own padded slot. The constant dampness was a relentless enemy. These protective boxes were often made from dense, oily woods like teak, which resisted warping, and were frequently rubbed with linseed oil to create an additional barrier against the pervasive salt air. The responsibility for these tools fell to the master navigator himself. He was the guardian of the ship's position on the globe, and his first duty upon coming off watch was to carefully clean, dry, and return each instrument to its sanctuary. The ship might be tossed by the sea, but inside their velvet nests, the astrolabe and quadrant remained still, waiting for the next clear night when the stars would reappear to guide them. This careful ritual of storage and maintenance was a quiet act of faith, a belief that human ingenuity, properly protected, could indeed conquer the trackless ocean. The most fragile cargo was not made of wood or iron, but of paper. Every voyage generated a vital paper trail, a fragile collection of words and lines that held the mission's legal authority and its only hope of being remembered. The captain's official logbook was the ship's legal and financial heartbeat. Bound in leather and filled with heavy linen-based paper, it was a daily record of course, speed, weather, and discipline. Every flogging for insubordination, every sighting of land, every barrel of water consumed was meticulously noted. This was not a personal diary, it was a corporate document, intended for the eyes of the voyage sponsors. Its entries were proof of the crew's efforts, a justification for the immense investment, and sometimes evidence in a court-martial. Alongside this public record, many captains kept a private journal. Here, they could confess their fears, record the strange behaviors of the crew, or sketch the bizarre flora and fauna they encountered. This private log often held the real story, the human tension, and wonder that the official record could not capture. The accuracy of their journey, however, depended on the maps they carried. These sea charts were precious artifacts, often hand-copied and wildly speculative. Coastlines would fade into decorative monsters with the phrase "here be dragons," a literal admission of ignorance. A chart might show a vast, open sea where a continent actually stood, or depict a non-existent strait that promised a faster route to the riches of the East. These errors were not mere mistakes. They were traps that could lure an entire ship and its crew to their doom. The most secret document aboard was the packet of sealed orders. Given to the captain by the Crown or the trading company, these instructions were not to be opened until the ship reached a specific latitude. Until that moment, even the captain might not know the mission's true destination or purpose. Breaking that wax seal was a moment of high drama, revealing whether they were to seek a northern passage, establish a colony, or raid a rival's shipping lane. All of this documentation required its own specialized survival kit. Ink was carried in sealed bottles, often made of thick, dark glass. Quills, typically from sturdy goose or swan feathers, were packed in bundles. And the paper itself, vulnerable to the slightest dampness, was stored in waxed leather bags or within dedicated wooden chests lined with oilcloth. A single leak could reduce weeks of observations to an unreadable blur, erasing their journey from history as completely as a sinking ship. But the human body was the most fragile cargo of all. Within the ship's crowded confines, a simple cut could fester, a broken bone could mean a lifetime of lameness, and a mysterious fever could sweep through the crew in days. To combat this, the ship's surgeon carried a chest of horrors and hopes, a collection of tools and remedies that represented the brutal limits of Renaissance medicine. His kit was a sobering mix of the practical and the profoundly misguided. Sharp, gleaming lancets were used for bloodletting, a practice based on the ancient belief that draining blood could rebalance the body's humors and cure everything from fever to melancholy. For closing a deep gash, there were needles and silk thread for crude sutures, a painful but sometimes effective way to seal a wound. Yet the same chest held substances that were as deadly as the diseases they treated. Mercury, a toxic heavy metal, was a standard treatment for syphilis, a disease that often traveled with the sailors. The patient would be subjected to salves and fumigations, poisoning them slowly in a desperate attempt to drive out the infection. For pain, there was laudanum, a potent tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. This was the era's ultimate painkiller, capable of rendering a man insensible during a traumatic amputation or easing the agony of a terminal illness. It offered a blessed, if addictive, numbness in a world of constant suffering. Alongside these harsh chemicals, the surgeon also relied on a pharmacy of herbal remedies passed down through generations. Dried willow bark, which we now know contains a precursor to aspirin, might be brewed into a tea to reduce fever and inflammation. Cloves or oil of cloves could be used for toothaches, and various poultices made from plants like comfrey were applied to wounds and broken bones to encourage healing. The ship's surgeon worked in a nightmarish environment, the cockpit. This was a dark, cramped space below decks, often next to the galley, where the ship's rolling motion was most extreme. Here, by the flickering light of a single lantern, he would perform amputations with a saw, cauterize stumps with a hot iron, and extract teeth with crude forceps. His success relied less on formal medical knowledge and more on sheer practical experience, a strong stomach, and the grim acceptance that for many ailments, his only true tool was hope. Yet beyond the surgeon's grim chest lay another, far more splendid collection, packed not for the body's ailments, but for the ailments of diplomacy. For every explorer knew that survival depended not just on strong ropes and full bellies, but on successful first impressions with the powerful rulers they would meet. These were not the simple trade goods for common exchange. These were the crown jewels of the voyage, intended to dazzle, intimidate, and secure favor. A king or a high chieftain could not be courted with glass beads and brass bells. For them, the holds contained objects of undeniable power and sophistication, designed to communicate the wealth and technological might of the explorer's homeland. One of the most potent gifts was a full suit of polished steel armor. To a leader who had never seen such craftsmanship, this was a marvel. The mirror-like finish, the intricate engravings, the sheer impenetrability of the metal plates. It was a walking fortress, a gift that demonstrated military superiority while offering a personal, magnificent defense. Alongside the armor, they might pack a fine, wheelick pistol or an ornate musket, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and silver wire. This was more than a weapon. It was a piece of art and engineering, a symbol of deadly precision that could be displayed as a trophy of a new alliance. Time itself could be packaged as a gift. Elaborate clocks and mechanical astrolabes were highly prized. The steady, mesmerizing tick of a clock, the predictable movement of its hands marking hours in a world that told time by the sun, this was a form of magic. It presented the explorer not as a mere sailor, but as a master of unseen forces, a bearer of knowledge that could measure the heavens and partition the day. Religious artifacts were another carefully chosen diplomatic tool. A beautifully illustrated Bible, a finely carved crucifix of ivory or ebony, or a set of silver communion chalices served a dual purpose. They were offerings of spiritual goodwill, but they were also profound statements of cultural and theological identity, intended to showcase the depth and grandeur of the explorer's faith. Perhaps the most personal gift and the most revealing was a set of formal clothing intended for the foreign ruler himself. A doublet of velvet, a cloak of silk trimmed with ermine. These were not just fabrics, they were costumes for a new role. By dressing a local leader in European finery, the explorer was subtly attempting a transformation, inviting him to see himself as part of a new, global hierarchy of power. Each of these extravagant items was a calculated risk, a wager that the shock of the new could open doors that force could not. In the end, the most valuable thing in the hold might not be a barrel of gunpowder, but a single, ticking clock, waiting to whisper the hour of a new era into a king's ear. A new kind of treasure hunter began to walk the decks, his cargo not gold but knowledge. As the Enlightenment dawned, the goals of exploration shifted from pure conquest to a ravenous curiosity, and the ship's hold had to make room for a new kind of luggage, the scientist's kit. These naturalists were packers of a different sort, their mission to capture, preserve, and categorize the very essence of the New World. Their supplies were a delicate arsenal against decay and forgetting. Specimen jars of all sizes, made of thick glass with airtight stoppers, were carefully wrapped in straw and packed into sturdy crates. Some would be filled with clear alcohol, a preserving fluid to suspend a bizarre fish or a rare frog for the long journey home, turning a living creature into a permanent object of study. For the world of plants, there were the presses, simple but effective wooden frames with layers of absorbent paper. A newly discovered flower or fern would be laid carefully between these sheets, then squeezed tight, slowly drying it flat and locking its form and color for eternity. This was how a forest was folded into a book, but not every discovery could be bottled or pressed. For the fleeting colors of a butterfly's wing or the intricate structure of a seashell, the naturalist relied on his sketching materials. He carried precious cakes of watercolor paint, fine brushes with hairs from sable or squirrel, and portfolios of heavy, textured paper. In the flickering light of a tent or aboard a rocking ship, he would spend hours translating the living world into a precise, two-dimensional record. These drawings were more than art. They were scientific data, the only way to capture the iridescent sheen of a hummingbird or the complex pattern on a snake's skin before the actual specimen began to deteriorate. How do you capture a creature that will not stay still? Nets of fine, strong silk were essential tools, used to snare dazzling beetles or delicate butterflies without damaging their fragile wings. For larger birds, stronger nets and even small cages might be used, a temporary prison for a living specimen whose songs and behaviors were as much a subject of study as its feathers and bones. Every item in this kit, from the smallest jar to the largest press, served a single, monumental purpose: to stop time. It was an attempt to bring order to the overwhelming chaos of nature, to build a cabinet of curiosities that contained an entire continent. Each pressed leaf and pickled lizard was a puzzle piece in a grand project to name and understand the whole of creation, a project that would reshape humanity's very place in the world. Every single item on the master list now confronted its final physical test. The ship's hold was a three-dimensional puzzle where a single misplaced barrel could doom the entire voyage. The art of stowage was a precise science, a battle against the ocean's relentless motion. The fundamental rule was simple, yet its execution was complex. Heavy things went low, and lighter things went high. This principle of keeping the ship's center of gravity as deep as possible was the key to preventing a catastrophic capsize in a storm. The heaviest objects aboard were the ship's own guns, its cannons. These massive iron weapons were secured on the gun deck, their weight sitting just above the keel, the backbone of the ship. Directly below them, in the very bottom of the hold, lay the ballast. This was not cargo, but pure, dead weight, typically thousands of pounds of rounded stones or iron ingots. The ballast's sole job was to act as a counterweight to the force of the wind pressing against the sails above, a hidden anchor that kept the ship upright. Next came the heaviest consumable supplies, the thousands of casks of fresh water and beer. These were arranged carefully on top of the ballast stones, their immense liquid weight adding to the ship's stability. They were packed tightly together, wedged with wooden chocks to prevent any shifting. A barrel that broke loose in a storm became a battering ram, smashing into other casks and the very ribs of the ship, a single runaway object capable of starting a fatal leak. Above this foundational layer of weight, the rest of the cargo found its place. The lighter, bulkier items were stored higher up: bales of cloth, bundles of tools, and the naturalist's delicate crates were secured in the 'tween decks, the space between the hold and the main deck. Even here, every item had its designated spot based on need and fragility. Items that might be required quickly during the voyage, like spare sailcloth or a chest of trade goods for a sudden landing, were stored near hatches or in more accessible lockers. The ship's carpenter and his wood, however, were often kept readily available, as storm damage could strike at any moment and required an immediate response. The entire process was supervised by the ship's master, a man who understood the vessel's anatomy like his own. He directed the crew as they used block and tackle to lower each item into its precise position, creating a perfectly balanced ecosystem of wood, stone, and hope. A poorly stowed ship was a sluggish, dangerous vessel, wallowing in the waves and slow to answer the helm. But a perfectly balanced ship was a living thing, cutting through the water with purpose, its hidden weight a silent promise of a safe return. Within this floating fortress of cargo, each man claimed a tiny kingdom of damp wood and darkness. The crew's quarters were not built for comfort, but for pure utility, a cramped labyrinth of hammocks and sea chests packed into the bow of the ship, a space known as the forecastle. Here, the air was thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and the faint, ever-present tang of brine. A sailor did not have a room, he had a sliver of space, his canvas hammock strung just inches from his shipmates, swaying in unison with the ship's relentless roll. This was a world of constant contact and snatched privacy, where every cough and snore was shared. His only true personal territory was his sea chest, a stout, lockable wooden box that served as his wardrobe, his safe, and his only connection to a life beyond the waves. These chests were marvels of compact organization. Inside, a sailor's entire world was folded and stacked. His spare woolen shirts and trousers, his stockings, and his prized oilskin coat were carefully rolled to save space and to keep them as dry as possible in the pervasive damp. His sewing kit, or housewife, was essential for the endless task of mending tears and darning socks, a small act of self-preservation. A personal knife, a spoon, and a wooden or horn cup for his daily rations completed his practical kit. Yet nestled among these necessities were the objects that truly defined a man's spirit on the long, lonely journey. A small, worn book of psalms or a collection of ballads offered escape, the words read and reread by the dim light filtering through a deck grate. A pair of dice, carved from bone, represented the hope of a lucky throw and a moment of camaraderie during a rare off-watch. For some, it was a small musical instrument like a tin whistle or a fiddle, its melodies a fleeting bridge back to the pubs and hearths of home. The most poignant tokens were the smallest: a locket containing a curl of hair from a sweetheart, a miniature portrait of a child he had never met, or a smooth stone picked up on a beach in a port he would likely never see again. These were not mere trinkets, they were anchors. In the pitch black of a stormy night, with the ship groaning around him, a sailor's hand would close around that smooth stone or that metal locket. It was a physical touchstone to a world that was solid and still, a silent prayer against the chaos. The careful curation of this tiny chest was a profound act of psychological defense, a way to pack not just supplies, but sanity itself. The packing list for a voyage was never a static document, but a living record of changing ambitions. Compare the holds of Christopher Columbus's ships in 1492 with those of Captain James Cook 2 centuries later, and you witness a profound shift in human purpose. Columbus and Vasco da Gama were pioneers of survival, their vessels crammed with the raw essentials for a desperate leap into the void. Their primary goal was to reach a destination, any destination, and return alive with proof. The cargo was overwhelmingly practical: hardtack and salt meat, casks of water and wine, and a basic arsenal of weapons, and trade goods like beads and cloth. Every item answered a simple, urgent question: how do we not die today? There was little room for scientific inquiry, for their mission was born of commerce and conquest, a race for routes and riches. Their logs recorded coastlines and potential threats, but the world itself was merely a backdrop to the drama of their arrival. A century later, the priorities began to twist. By the time Cook's Endeavour set sail in the 1760s, the very definition of essential supplies had transformed. The ship still carried its salt pork and hardtack, but now it also carried a portable observatory. Cook's holds were a hybrid ecosystem, containing both the traditional tools of survival and a stunning array of scientific instruments: chronometers for measuring longitude, telescopes for observing the transit of Venus, and artists' supplies for documenting everything from botanical specimens to cultural practices. The mission was no longer just to survive the journey, but to understand the journey itself, to map the ocean's currents, to chart the stars with new precision, and to systematically catalog the natural world. This evolution is starkly visible in the personnel. Columbus sailed with sailors, soldiers, and a priest. Cook's crew included astronomers, naturalists like Joseph Banks, and artists. The presence of these civilians, these men of science who were not essential to the sailing of the ship, signaled a monumental change. Space once reserved for an extra barrel of gunpowder was now allocated for a crate of specimen jars. The daily ration of rum was balanced against the need for clean alcohol to preserve rare insects. This was the Enlightenment manifest as logistics, a belief that knowledge was a cargo as valuable as gold, and that a voyage was not truly successful unless it brought back discoveries for all of humanity. Even the trade goods evolved. While Cook still carried nails and cloth, he also brought livestock, goats, pigs, and sheep, not for food, but as gifts intended to introduce new species to foreign continents, an act that reveals a new, long-term vision of reshaping the worlds they encountered. The packing list had become a blueprint for empire, not just of land, but of knowledge itself. Polar expeditions rewrote every rule of expedition packing. For these men, the ship was merely a taxi to the edge of a new world, a world of absolute cold where a single miscalculation in their supplies meant a swift, frozen death. The packing list for an Antarctic voyage was a document of pure defiance against an elemental enemy. Their first and most critical defense was their clothing. Gone were the simple woolens of the age of sail, replaced by intricate, layered systems. Next to the skin, they wore lightweight wool or silk undergarments. Over this came a thick middle layer of wool, and then an outer shell of tightly woven cotton gabardine, known as Burberry cloth, which was windproof yet breathable. They experimented with new materials like reindeer fur, whose hollow hairs provided superior insulation, and felt boots known as finnesko, made from the soft leg fur of reindeer, which were essential for preventing frostbite in the brutal temperatures. Every stitch, every button was a matter of survival. Their sustenance was equally specialized. Hardtack and salt pork were useless here, as they would freeze solid. The ultimate polar food was pemmican, a dense, high-energy paste made from pounded dried meat and rendered fat, sometimes with berries added. It was a calorie bomb, designed to fuel immense physical exertion in sub-zero conditions. A man could consume thousands of calories a day just to stay warm, and pemmican delivered that energy in a compact, non-freezing form. It was often boiled with snow to create a thick, hot stew called hoosh, the culinary centerpiece of life on the ice. But food and clothing were useless without the means to move them. This introduced the most dramatic addition to the packing list, the sledges. These were not simple toboggans, but meticulously crafted wooden vehicles, often made from hickory or ash, designed to carry loads of up to 1,000 pounds. They were shod with steel runners and fitted with intricate lashings. The packing of a sledge was an art form in itself, a perfectly balanced load where the weight of scientific instruments, tents, and pemmican had to be distributed for optimal pulling. And to pull them, explorers packed the most vital companions of all, their dogs. Sled dogs, typically hardy breeds like Greenland Huskies, were not pets. They were a hybrid of tractor and comrade. Their strength was the only engine that could conquer the sastrugi, the waves of hard snow that made the terrain a frozen ocean. The relationship was one of brutal necessity and deep affection, a partnership where the survival of men literally depended on the paws of their canine team. This entire elaborate system, from the layered wool to the panting dogs, was a fortress built against the cold. Yet the ice had its own relentless strategy, a silent war of attrition where metal would shatter, leather would split, and a single lost mitten could mean the loss of a hand. While polar expeditions battled the cold, a different kind of journey was being packed on the other side of the world, one that would trade the open ocean for the treacherous currents of an unknown continent. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a core of discovery, and its packing list was a masterpiece of overland logistics, a complete reinvention of what it meant to be prepared. Their primary vessel was not a deep-hulled ship, but a 55-foot keelboat, a shallow draft workhorse designed to navigate the mighty Missouri River. This floating warehouse was packed to the gunwales with a very specific kind of cargo, one intended not for conquest, but for diplomacy and science. The most significant portion of their hold was dedicated to gifts for the Native American tribes they would encounter. This was not the simple bead and mirror trade of earlier sea voyages. President Thomas Jefferson himself had a hand in selecting these items, which were chosen to demonstrate American friendship and technological prowess. There were peace medals, struck with Jefferson's profile on one side and symbols of peace on the other, meant to be presented to chiefs as tokens of a new nation's goodwill. They packed bundles of high-quality knives, tomahawks, and brightly colored cloth, all intended as gifts to secure safe passage and essential information. The most ingenious items were the technology demonstrations, like a portable corn mill designed to show a more efficient way to grind grain, a subtle offer of a better way of life. Alongside these diplomatic tools was a full scientific laboratory. Lewis and Clark carried the finest instruments available for mapping the uncharted territory, including a chronometer for determining longitude, a sextant for measuring the angle of the sun, and surveying chains for precise distance measurement. They had presses for preserving plant specimens and bottles of alcohol for pickling new species of reptiles and fish. Their mandate was to document everything, from the soil composition to the weather patterns, and their supplies reflected this encyclopedic mission. Yet, the most critical calculation on their list was the acknowledgement of their own ignorance. They knew they could not possibly carry enough food for a 2-year journey into a land with no supply depots. Their strategy was one of planned reliance. They packed barrels of salt, not to preserve meat they brought, but to preserve the meat they hoped to hunt along the way. Their success depended on becoming part of the landscape, living off the bounty of the land as they moved. The expedition became a moving feast, its survival shifting from the supplies in the keelboat to the skill of its hunters. When the great buffalo herds appeared, the men would feast, and the air would be thick with the smoke of drying meat. When game was scarce, they relied on their own ingenuity and the generosity of the tribes they met, trading a peace medal for a bushel of corn or a knife for directions to a safe mountain pass. The keelboat was their lifeline, but it was also a temporary one. As they moved westward, they would cache supplies, burying barrels of gunpowder, food, and trade goods for their return journey. This act of burying their own future sustenance was a profound act of faith, a wager that they would survive long enough to need it. The packing list for Lewis and Clark was a living document, constantly edited by the landscape itself, a perfect fusion of preparedness and adaptation that would unlock a continent. The perfect packing list was a promise made on solid ground, a promise the sea loved to break. No matter how meticulously they calculated, voyages stretched into years, storms rerouted them, and the brutal reality of scarcity set in. The true test of an explorer was not in the grand departure, but in the grim art of improvisation when the supplies ran low. Clothing, worn thin by salt and sun, became the first casualty. A torn shirt was not thrown away. It was meticulously patched with scraps of old sailcloth. The ship's sailmaker, his needles already busy with the great canvas sails above, would turn his skills to the crew's ragged garments. A patch on a knee or a reinforced elbow, stiff and rough, was a badge of endurance, a tiny fortress of canvas holding a man together. When tools broke or were lost overboard, the ship's blacksmith and carpenter became alchemists of scrap. A broken iron hoop from a burst cask could be hammered flat on the forge and reshaped into a new knife blade. Splinters from a damaged spar were whittled down into belaying pins or trenchers, the wooden plates from which they ate. Nothing was truly discarded. Everything held potential for a second, third, or fourth life. But the most desperate ingenuity was reserved for the emptiness in their stomachs. When the hardtack was gone and the last stringy bits of salt pork had been devoured, hunger became the ship's new captain. The rats that had stowed away in the hold, once a nuisance, became a prized source of protein. Catching them became a vital skill, and a plump rodent roasting over a galley fire was a feast. When even the rats were scarce, they turned to the unthinkable. Leather, which had protected them from the elements, now became a last resort for sustenance. They would cut the tough leather from their jerkins, their boots, and even from protective covers on the ship, boiling it for hours to soften it into a barely edible, gelatinous pulp. In the very worst moments, when hope itself seemed to be rationed, men would chew on bits of tallow candle or gnaw on splinters of wood, tricking their bodies into the motion of eating. These were not acts of madness, but of stark, calculated survival, a testament to the human will to see one more sunrise, even if it meant consuming the very world that carried them. The true measure of an expedition's success was not what left the harbor, but what returned in its place. The ship that finally limped back into its home port was a ghost of its former self, its hull scarred and its holds transformed. Gone were the neatly stacked barrels of salt pork and hardtack, the pristine bolts of trade cloth, the chests of glass beads. In their place rested a new, alien cargo, the physical proof of a world that had, until then, existed only in rumor. The most immediate treasures were those that appealed to the senses and the purse. The air in the hold was thick with the scent of exotic spices. a fragrant cloud of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. There were chests of Chinese silk, a fabric so fine and smooth it felt like a whisper against the skin, and crates of gleaming porcelain that captured the light in a way European pottery never could. For the voyage financiers, the most welcome sight was the heavy, dull gleam of gold and silver ingots, the cold, hard answer to their immense financial gamble. Yet for the curious minds of the age, these material riches were often overshadowed by the living cargo. The ship's deck might be crowded with pots containing strange, stunted trees, their branches heavy with unfamiliar fruit. Below, naturalists carefully tended to cages holding brightly plumed parrots that shrieked in unknown tongues, or timid animals like opossums or sloths, creatures whose very existence challenged established ideas of nature. Each of these living specimens was a mystery waiting to be unraveled. But the most transformative cargo was also the most fragile, the knowledge. The captain's logbook, now swollen with new entries and stained with salt water, was no longer just a ship's record, it was a key. Its pages contained the first accurate descriptions of ocean currents that could slash weeks off a future journey. It held sketches of coastlines that erased the sea monsters from the map, replacing them with safe harbors and dangerous reefs. The private journals were even more precious, filled with observations on the languages, customs, and politics of the peoples they had met. This was not just a travelogue, it was a diplomatic and strategic playbook for the next wave of contact. The updated charts were the crown jewels of this intellectual haul. A single map, based on thousands of celestial observations and painstaking coastal surveys, could render an entire fleet of rival ships obsolete. A newly discovered strait or accurately placed island became a state secret, a piece of information more valuable than a chest of pearls because it promised 1,000 more chests in the future. When the crew finally staggered down the gangplank, they carried with them more than just stories of adventure. They carried the seeds of new sciences, the blueprints for global trade, and the first fragmented images of a planet that was suddenly and irrevocably connected. The unpacking was not an end, but a beginning, the moment a distant shore reached back and began to reshape the world that had sent them forth. A perfect packing list was a beautiful theory, but the ocean was a brutal laboratory. For every success story, there are chilling tales of catastrophic oversights, moments where a single forgotten item or a misplaced priority spelled doom for an entire crew. The ghost of scurvy haunts these stories most persistently. Time and again, expeditions set sail with their holds packed with calories, but devoid of the one thing that could keep their men from literally falling apart: vitamin C. The classic example is Admiral George Anson's circumnavigation in the 1740s. His squadron left England with over 1,900 men, a powerful force. But they prioritized firepower and durable food over fresh provisions or anti-scorbutics. By the time they stumbled back to England years later, only 145 men remained. The rest had been slaughtered not by enemy cannon, but by scurvy. Their gums turned black and swollen, their teeth fell out, and old wounds reopened as their bodies lost the ability to heal itself. They had packed for a battle against the Spanish, but their greatest enemy was their own menu. A few crates of lemons or barrels of sauerkraut, items considered optional by some cost-cutting admirals, would have saved hundreds of lives. The failure was not one of courage, but of logistics. In frozen latitudes, a miscalculation in clothing could be just as fatal. The infamous Franklin expedition of 1845 serves as a grim monument to this error. Their ships, the Erebus and Terror, were technological marvels, equipped with steam engines and reinforced iron hulls. Yet their personal kits were tragically rooted in an older era. The crew was issued standard Royal Navy uniforms, heavy woolen coats, and trousers that were utterly inadequate for the Arctic cold. When the ships became hopelessly trapped in the ice, the men attempted to walk to safety, dragging heavy sledges across the treacherous landscape. Their woolen clothing, when soaked with sweat, lost its insulating properties and froze solid, becoming a suit of ice that sapped their body heat and accelerated their demise. They had packed the clothes of sailors, not the clothes of polar survivors. Sometimes the oversight was not in the food or the clothing, but in the very sinews of the ship itself. A voyage could be perfectly provisioned with the finest hardtack and the most effective anti-scorbutics, but without the means to propel the vessel, it was just a floating prison. Expeditions that skimped on spare sails and rigging components were gambling with the wind itself. A sudden squall could shred a set of sails in hours, leaving a ship stranded and unable to steer. Without spare canvas, rope, and pulleys, the crew was left to patch together a solution with whatever scraps remained, often reducing their speed to a crawl and turning a planned voyage of months into an ordeal of years. In these extended journeys, the original rations would be consumed, leading back to the familiar specters of starvation and disease. The sea offered no second chances for such oversights. The margin for error was as thin as the parchment their maps were drawn on, and the price of a single unchecked box on the master list was measured in human lives. Commanding a wooden world required its own peculiar comforts. While the crew huddled in the forecastle, the captain's cabin was a sanctuary of civilization, a space where the immense psychological weight of command was eased by a few extraordinary personal possessions. He might pack an entire library of books, a portable universe of knowledge and escape. Volumes on navigation and geography sat beside works of philosophy, history, and poetry. In the flickering light of a whale oil lamp, after a day of navigating by the stars, a captain could lose himself in the verses of Virgil or the speculations of Plutarch, finding solace in the thoughts of men long dead while sailing toward lands yet unborn. This was not mere leisure, it was mental sustenance, a way to keep his mind sharp and his spirit anchored to a wider world of ideas. For social and diplomatic occasions, he brought the trappings of a gentleman's home. Fine china, polished silver cutlery, and crystal decanters were carefully swaddled in linen and packed in sturdy chests. These were not for daily use, but for the precise theater of diplomacy. Inviting a local chieftain or the captain of a rival ship to dine aboard was a calculated move, and serving a meal on fine porcelain with proper silverware was a silent, powerful statement. It communicated authority, refinement, and resources, suggesting that the man who commanded such civility in the middle of an ocean also commanded immense power back home. Music provided another vital release. A captain with an ear for melody might bring a violin or a flute, its case carefully cushioned against the damp. The sound of music floating across the quiet deck on a calm evening was a balm for the entire crew, a momentary bridge across the rigid hierarchy of shipboard life. It was a deeply human sound in a world of creaking timbers and howling wind. And then there were the companions that asked for nothing but a little food and affection. Captains frequently brought pets aboard to ward off the profound loneliness of command. A dog provided unquestioning loyalty and a warm presence in the cabin, its simple needs a grounding routine. Cats were valued as much for their companionship as for their skill in controlling the rats that infested the hold. A parrot, with its brilliant plumage and ability to mimic human speech, was a living piece of wonder, a spark of the exotic even before they reached distant shores. These creatures were confidants, their silent understanding or cheerful squawking a remedy for the isolation that came with ultimate responsibility. In the end, these personal luxuries were not indulgences. They were essential tools for preserving the captain's humanity, ensuring the man who held the power of life and death over his crew did not become a monster of the deep. Yet for the common sailor, the captain's world of books and silver was a distant galaxy. His entire life was compressed into a single canvas sea bag, a humble repository holding everything he owned and everything he was. While the captain dined on fine china, the sailor ate from a dented tin plate, drinking his daily ration of beer or rum from a matching cup. His cutlery was often just his personal sheath knife, a tool used for everything from cutting his salt meat to whittling a piece of wood during a rare moment of rest. This knife was an extension of his own hands, its edge kept sharp not for fighting, but for the 10,000 small tasks that constituted survival. His wardrobe was a study in brutal simplicity. A single change of clothes, perhaps an extra woolen shirt and a pair of trousers, was all the luxury space would allow. These spare garments were not for variety, but for the desperate hope that one set might dry out while he shivered in the other, his body perpetually damp from ocean spray and cold sweat. His most important piece of furniture was his hammock, a canvas sling that he would string up in the crowded, reeking forecastle. This was his bed, his chair, and his only claim to a few square feet of personal space in a world of overwhelming communal living. Slung between the ship's timbers, he would sway in a forced rhythm with his snoring shipmates, the canvas rubbing against his back with every roll of the ship. But within this meager collection, you would almost always find one object that defied pure utility, a small, worn token of a life left behind. It could be a smooth, oddly shaped stone from his home village, a rabbit's foot, a carved piece of bone, or a saint's medallion. This was his lucky charm, a tangible piece of superstition and memory. He would clutch it during a storm, his lips moving in a silent prayer as waves crashed over the deck. He would touch it for reassurance before going aloft to reef the sails in a screaming gale, high above the safety of the deck. This charm held no monetary value, but its worth was incalculable. It was a tether to a world of solid ground and familiar faces, a private religion in a universe governed by the cruel and random logic of the sea. The sea bag was more than a storage container. It was a portrait of a life lived on the edge of oblivion, where a dry shirt was a treasure, and a tiny carved bird was the only thing standing between a man and the abyss. That sea chest, packed with such care on a European dock, became a Trojan horse on a global scale. Its contents unleashed a biological and cultural revolution we now call the Columbian Exchange, a transfer between old and new worlds that rewrote the destiny of every continent. The most profound changes often sprouted from the smallest items. Seeds, tucked into pouches by hopeful explorers, were agents of ecological transformation. When European wheat and barley were planted in American soil, and when potatoes and maize from the Americas were carried back across the ocean, the very foundation of the world's diet was upended. The humble potato, once confined to the Andes, would eventually fuel a population boom in Europe, while sugarcane, introduced to the Caribbean, would tragically reshape global labor systems. This was not a simple swap of crops. It was a total reorganization of agriculture, landscapes, and power. But the ship's hold carried invisible passengers far more devastating than any sea. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Europeans had developed some resistance, were utterly alien to the immune systems of indigenous populations. These microbes, stowed away unknowingly in the bodies of the crew, acted with a swift and terrible efficiency. They raced ahead of the explorers themselves, sometimes emptying entire villages before the first European ever set foot there. The weapons and tools packed for trade had a double-edged impact. The introduction of metal, from iron axe heads to steel knives, revolutionized daily life, making tasks from hunting to woodworking exponentially easier. Yet these same metals were quickly reforged into arrowheads and spear points, intensifying conflicts between tribes and altering the balance of power forever. The explorers did not just pack for a journey, they packed the very components of a new world order. The glass beads and mirrors were not merely trinkets. They were the thin end of a wedge, introducing new concepts of value and desire that would gradually erode traditional economies. The legacy of these packing lists is written in the very food we eat, the languages we speak, and the interconnected world we inhabit today. A decision to pack a sack of wheat seeds or a crate of nails set in motion a chain of consequences that would echo for centuries, proving that the most powerful cargo is often the one you never intended to carry. These meticulous lists were blueprints for the impossible. Every barrel of salt pork, every iron nail, and every polished lens represented a leap of faith, a declaration that the human will could indeed conquer the vast and terrifying blank spaces on the map. The age of discovery was not won by bravery alone, but by this incredible forethought, by the quiet genius of men who understood that survival depended on a perfect marriage of logistics and imagination. They packed for storms they could not predict, and for shores they could not yet see, their ships becoming arks carrying not just men, but the seeds of entire new worlds. So the next time you zip up a suitcase for a simple trip, pause for a moment. Think of those explorers staring at a mountain of supplies, forced to choose what was essential for a journey into the absolute unknown. What would you pack if you were setting sail for a horizon with no guarantee of return? Your own list would tell a story about what you value, what you fear, and what you believe is truly necessary to build a new world from scratch.